by Kost and Willow Higgins, who recently published an in-depth investigation into conviction integrity units (CIUs) in the New York. I'll redo this again later. Their report uncovered troubling findings about these units meant to correct wrongful convictions. All failed the people that were created to help. This story is a collaboration between New York Focus and Columbia Journalism Investigations, an investigative reporting unit at Columbia Journalism School. CIUs operate within the district attorney's offices and are intended to review cases where wrongful convictions may have occurred. But as Ryan and Willow's reporting reveals, many of these units lack transparency, oversight, and effectiveness. Some CIUs have denied applicants' claims only for the courts to later exonerate them. So, welcome both to the program, Ryan and Willow.
Thanks.
So, Ryan, let's start with you. Just break it down. I did a very brief intro of what exactly is a CIU, but if you could tell exactly what is a conviction integrity unit and why do they exist?
Sure. Yeah. A conviction integrity unit, which also goes by the name of a conviction review unit, is basically a unit that is supposed to look into claims of wrongful convictions. They started around 2007, but have really gained steam over the past decade as a piece of this progressive prosecutor movement in the criminal justice system to right some of the wrongs of an overly carceral system. Essentially, it's supposed to be a non-adversarial process. So as opposed to a normal court case where you have a defense and a prosecutor sort of working against each other, this is supposed to be a collaborative process where everybody sort of shares notes and tries to work toward the truth of the situation and exonerate people who are in prison unjustly.
Okay. Now, Willow, let's talk about what are some of how common are CIUs in New York and Ryan explains exactly what they do, but how common are CIUs? I'm looking at your reporting, like where's Sullivan County and doesn't look like Sullivan County has one.
Yeah, exactly. So there are 17 across the state of New York and 17 different counties. That is more than most states, actually all states except for California. So New York is on the leaderboard in terms of how many, how many exist in this state. But really, they're designed to provide like an additional avenue of relief for people who might be wrongfully convicted. So while they are sort of like novelty programs, they are, like Ryan mentioned, picking up steam as an option for people to pursue if they feel like they're incarcerated unjustly.
So, like you mentioned, like I said, not all counties have CIUs. Should they have CIUs if they don't have them?
That's an interesting question. And I guess it's a question I would leave up to folks who've read our investigation. And we'd love to hear from you on that front. But I think in terms of the people we've spoken to, answers would vary depending on who you ask. Some say that these CIUs have only allowed district attorneys who've wrongfully convicted people in the first place to have additional control and agency over the narratives of errors that they've made. It's like a fox guarding the hen house situation. And so they say maybe it's just not a good idea. Others would disagree and say it's so challenging to get exonerated. It's better to have a CIU than not. After interviewing hundreds of people, Ryan and I came to the conclusion that maybe a good option would be to back this concept by legislation that would provide the units additional funding that comes with strings attached, that with transparency standards and like a level playing field across the board, across like counties across the state to make sure that people are playing by the rules. But again, I think it's a good question. And I think it's a question that people should ponder if they're thinking about criminal justice reform issues.
Yeah, no, definitely. And we're planning to have our own DA on the air soon. So it's one of the questions I do have for him now, since your reporting has come out. So, Ryan, let's talk about your investigation found that many of the CIUs are not doing their job well. Can you share with us what is the problems that they're facing?
Yeah, I would say there's two buckets here. So if you look upstate at the 12 CIUs that are outside of New York City, they have largely not exonerated many people at all. Actually, we can say that half of all the CIUs, or almost half of all the CIUs in New York State, have not exonerated a single person. The 12 CIUs outside of the city specifically have only supported 12 exonerations between them. And they've been around for an average of 6 years, and they collectively boast 36 staff members. So it's not a lot of exonerations essentially for such an amount of time and amount of staff. For the units that do actually produce exonerations, we found some other issues. We heard from people who have applied to these units that they move really slowly, that they're not very transparent. Applicants told us like they were often left in the dark, not knowing whether or not their application had been accepted or denied on its face. As Willow mentioned, there's not a lot of oversight here. So we found that they could be vulnerable to internal pressures. For instance, we found that 40% of the cases we analyzed that a prosecutor who had handled the original one was working at the DA's office as their colleagues were reinvestigating that. So that creates some conflict of interest. They're also vulnerable to political pressures because ultimately this is something a DA sets up, and the DA's, it's their name on the line here. So if they're worried about a politically vulnerable exoneration, they can end it if they want, or they can fast forward it if they want. Ultimately, these units only answer to the people who created them.
And you share a couple of stories, two stories in your article. One is of a person named Calvin. Hopefully, I don't pronounce his last name wrong. Bori? How do you pronounce his last name?
Yeah, Calvin Bari.
Bari, okay. Who was wrongfully convicted and spent 21 years in prison. Let's talk about how did the CIU handle his case?
Yeah, so Calvin had been in prison for almost half of his 50-year sentence. He'd been convicted of a double homicide in the Bronx. And he and his attorneys had brought a motion to the courts essentially outlining a case for his innocence, which included 5 new witnesses that had vouched for his innocence. They said they'd either seen the person who had done it or they'd seen Calvin at the time of the murder, and he couldn't possibly have been the one who did it. And just as they were getting ready to pursue this, the Bronx DA's office approached them and said, wait, hold off. We have this new unit that is supposed to look into these sorts of issues, and we'd love to do this collaborative investigation with you. His case seemed like a great fit for it. So he ultimately decided to push forward, thinking maybe this new progressive prosecutor movement would finally see the truth in his case. But almost immediately, his attorney started hearing from some of those witnesses that they felt like they were being intimidated by the investigator. One witness, for instance, the investigators showed up at her women's shelter unannounced, which was against their rules. And so she was ultimately asked to leave the shelter. And that costed her bed there. She had to then front money for her own apartment. And it really ruined a new start for her, or at least really destabilized that new start initially. Anyways, the whole investigation lasted for about a year until the CIU came to Calvin and his attorneys and said, we just don't think that what we found here leads to your exoneration. We can't support it. So Calvin and his attorneys turned back to the courts, and 4 months later, a judge had exonerated him or had tossed out his conviction, citing exactly the same evidence that the CIU had looked at. And the judge also went further and a reinvestigation. He called some of their actions unconscionable.
About how they treated the case and treated the evidence in the case?
Yeah, treated the witnesses showing up, for instance, at the shelter unannounced, he thought was out of line. There was another witness who said that she felt so threatened by their tactics that she actually had her doctor write a medical note in case she could present it to the court. It just seems like they were all very rattled, and the judge agreed that their actions had been out of bounds.
Wow. Now, Willow, you have another story that you share with us with Anthony Miller, whose case was also mishandled with the CIU process. Can you talk about that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So Anthony Miller, he was convicted in Rochester, which is Monroe County, upstate, for an armed robbery that he did not commit. And basically, the investigation from the jump was just really thin. There's evidence in his CIU file that shows that they tracked the scent of the gunman with like canine like trackers that showed that the actual gunman went in a completely different direction than where Miller was found. That's just the baseline, the very beginning of a really poorly conducted investigation. He wasn't found with the crimes. He didn't fit the description of the man who was described on the 911 call. And basically, he petitioned to the CIU. He was really excited about it because he was not having luck as a pro se defendant, which is a defendant who is not working with the assistant attorney. They're going at it alone. He was not having luck by himself fighting his case. And so he was honestly like praying for a conviction integrity unit to be launched because he just was like, maybe if they put a process in line, I might be able to stand a fighting chance here. And his prayers were answered. Monroe County did launch a CIU, but it just did not go his way. It was fairly similar to what Ryan described in that the CIU picked up the case. It was one of the county's first cases they investigated. They investigated it for several months. Like through a FOIL request, we see the papers that the CIU deliberated on, and we know that they were given this and that they had access to this information. That shows like a pretty thin investigation and complaints that are too long of a laundry list for me to bother you with now. But they essentially were not able, like their committee was not able to come to a consensus, and so they took a pass on his case. Our reporting showed that the CIU looked at it again a year later because someone wanted to double check it, made the same decision, decided to decline Anthony, which was basically a year of Anthony waiting for someone to like just take a look at the evidence and deciding against it. And then a few months later, just like Calvin Borey, a judge comes out and says there is considerable objective innocence. He actually won an appeal in this case, which is a little bit different than some of the other exonerations. But the appellate court says there's considerable objective evidence of his innocence. You basically just charge the first Black man wearing a hoodie to the crime. This is not okay. Exonerates him. He ends up winning $6 million in court. So I think you had also asked just about like the takeaways in terms of what exonerees or particularly Anthony would say about this process. And most of the exonerees we've spoken with kind of end up saying the same thing, which is that this really feels political to them. Like in this particular instance, Sandra Dorley, the DA in Monroe County, campaigned multiple campaigns on launching a unit. She was up against a sort of progressive prosecutor who was really touting needs for criminal justice reform. So Anthony says she used this idea to give her an edge against her opponents, which is something that we've found DAs across the state are doing. It's a big talking piece in political campaigns. But ultimately, putting your money where your mouth is doesn't happen so often as you would like. And that's a story we hear again and again.
Yeah. So she was using it as, like I said, used to leverage for this campaign, saying that she will implement this and this will be clicking the box of justice reform.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And they would say, and I do believe that many of these units are like they're hiring smart people who care about conviction integrity issues, who are doing the work and ultimately they say are working hard to do their best. And I don't necessarily doubt that. It is undeniable the number of examples we've found where CIUs are making decisions that are not aligning with what the court is ultimately deciding sometimes years later. When different people are entitled to different opinions, and that's okay. Sometimes different members of the justice system will just make different decisions, and that's not necessarily a fault. But the fact of the matter in this case is that it's adding time to people's incarceration when they're not supposed to be there in the first place.
Now, Ryan, I'm seeing patterns here myself as we talk, but can you talk a little bit about the patterns you saw in the types of people affected by wrongful convictions, and are there common themes in their backgrounds or cases?
Yeah. So in terms of patterns, I guess first, the most obvious one is that the vast majority of the cases that we looked into are dealing with Black and brown people who are already disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system. So there's that to begin. I would also say that in quite a few of the cases, in the majority of the cases by far, there's always some sort of misconduct on somebody's part that has led to the wrongful conviction. And that's something that we'll get into in a future part of the series. But that misconduct could be by police, it could be by prosecutors, it could be by defense attorneys. But I would say that by and large, these wrongful convictions don't happen on accident. There are serious issues that are at hand in each of these people's cases. The other thing that I would note is that the majority of exonerees we looked at have been in prison for decades. So it's not as though they're getting out or that their exonerations are happening in a quick and timely manner. A lot of them have been fighting this fight for years, and it's really hard to reenter society after something like that has happened to you. So it really weighs on these people in their lives moving forward.
Yeah, it seems like there's a stigma attached to them because of their past.
Yeah, imagine that you were in prison for 20 years. You don't know how to use an iPhone. You don't know that banking has moved online and how to do that sort of thing. There's just all these things I think that we take for granted as a part of daily life today that would really shock a person who hasn't had that exposure. So yeah, it's a really surreal feeling from what I understand to just be out in the world after an experience like this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So those are about some of the patterns that you have reported on and saw. What changes, Ryan, could be made for that could make CIUs work better?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I would say that we've heard from reform-minded advocates that more oversight is really a key here. I don't think many of them necessarily want these programs to go away. What I heard actually was that they'd like them to be well funded and well run. But if they're going to get more funding, they would like there to be some sort of oversight. That might be standardized reporting. Brooklyn, for instance, is the only county that releases full reports on each of their exonerations. But not even that county releases reports on the cases that they decline. None of them have really offered up any sort of tracking that we could view that would show us which cases go to a review, which cases fail that review, which cases succeed in that review, which cases are declined by the DA themselves. That sort of information, if made public, would really help reporters like us and advocates in general get a better sense of what is happening inside these units. The other thing that some of them brought up was the possibility of creating a statewide CIU, which we have already had, and Willow actually has another investigation, another part of the series that's going to look specifically at what happened when the Attorney General created their own review unit. But yeah, those were some of the things that we heard from advocates.
Mm. Now, Willow, those are some of the bad CIUs. Are there any CIUs that are doing a good job, and what stands out for them?
Yeah, definitely. I guess I'll just reiterate that I do believe many of these units are trying. Whether or not they're doing a good job is a different question. And Brooklyn, so Kings County, Brooklyn is regarded as like a national model. Everyone looks to Brooklyn as just like the place that is doing it. And in all fairness, they have exonerated more than 40 people since they launched in, I believe, 2011, which is amazing. Like they have a staff, they set aside the money for a project like this, which is pretty radically different to like the other units we see upstate, where the problem is that they say they exist, but really they don't. Like maybe the DA is running it by themselves, but they've never actually received an application, and they've never received an application for review because people don't know it exists. There's only 5 people working in the office. So to say that they're doing like this conviction integrity project is a false promise when really that's not something that they're investing in. But even Brooklyn, which is, like I said, on the leaderboard for CIUs, they just have more room for error. Like we identified 27 failures in our investigation where 27 different people across the state applied for conviction integrity unit, were denied, and then were later exonerated through a different avenue. The bulk of those failures are actually coming from Brooklyn. And I think it's just because it's a bigger production. And in one instance, even in Brooklyn, a former chief years ago was actually let go because he was running the CIU and he denied an application from someone that he himself had prosecuted. And it turns out that he was the prosecutor in charge of a wrongful conviction that was denied on its face. Even like the Gold Star unit sometimes aren't always getting it right. But yeah. That's a tough question, but I think I'll pause there.
Yeah. Ryan, since the article has come out, have any of the officials responded to what was said in the article?
We actually have not heard from any of the DAs or CIUs themselves. That said, we have heard from a lot of folks in the innocence community who say that the story has been flying around, not just in New York, but across the country. I think there's a lot of interest in this topic, and our investigation, I think, is probably the most comprehensive investigation of how a state is running these units that's so far been done. And I think from what I've heard, we really address some of the issues that defense attorneys have been trying to vocalize for a long time. So we've gotten a lot of letters from folks thanking us for that. Attorney who said that he thought that our reporting might make it harder for CIUs to turned down applications that had facial merit. And so he's hopeful that it will put a fire under them to actually investigate claims of innocence. And then finally, we heard that a state senator in New York had actually brought up this series during a budget committee, asking the person there whether or not they ought to consider creating a subcommittee that would look at prosecutors' offices. And actually, there is one that is slowly ramping up, a committee on prosecutorial misconduct. We'll see how that plays out and whether or not they might look at some of the issues that the CIUs are dealing with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, Willow, having folks reading this article, you said that it brought things up to light to me that I wasn't aware of. I wasn't really aware of CIUs, to be honest with you, until reading your reporting. What do you want people to learn from this conversation about wrongful convictions?
Yeah, I guess my greatest takeaway, which is something that I would encourage others to reflect on as well, is that if you're wrongfully convicted, it is so hard to get exonerated. Like, it's really not for the faint of heart. It takes, I think, a combination of luck, privilege, and undescribable determination. Getting convicted and getting swept up into the system can happen pretty swiftly. You get arrested, you get indicted, maybe you take a plea deal, maybe you go to trial, but one way or another, it can happen fast. And after your arrest, things are basically out of your hands. On the other hand, fighting your case is incredibly hard and incredibly time consuming and resource intensive. Um, like the average amount of time from the 27 people who were failed by CIUs, they weren't exonerated and released from prison for 19 years. And that might even be, if you're incarcerated for murder, the average sentence is 25 to life. And the fact of the matter is, if you're wrongfully convicted, it takes a pretty good chunk of that sentence, more often than not, for you to just find your way out. And that's because the system is designed to be skeptical, and where judges have a tendency to believe that the prosecutors got the right guy in the first place, which isn't necessarily like a bad thing. That's just our justice system as it's designed. But the fact of the matter is that there are thousands of people who are wrongfully convicted. Like, studies suggest that there are, I think, 2,000 in New York alone that are sitting in prison for something that they didn't do. And so I think increasing the options for people who are not supposed to be incarcerated and maybe don't have the means to hire a top dollar attorney is, to me, something that's really important. And so our findings were disappointing because it's an important issue, and it's a good idea that people have really spent a lot of time thinking about and getting off the ground. So it would just be great if it was working more seamlessly. I think that's my takeaway. And I would just encourage others who are interested in like justice reform issues to contemplate how you might want to see things yourself and what you would want to be on the table if, heaven forbid, you were in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Ryan, Willow, before we leave, I just want to give maybe a heads up of what's coming up for this series, the ongoing series that you're working on with your focus.
Yeah, so the second day story should be out in the next week or so. And that looks at the cases where the CIU did move forward with an exoneration or with supporting an overturning a wrongful conviction. Like I mentioned, a lot of these wrongful convictions, there are errors that happen either on behalf of like police, the defense attorneys, but we're specifically looking in this story at errors that the prosecution may have made and whether or not these units are actually owning those errors and whether or not they're doing anything to prevent those errors going forward. So that's our second piece of the investigation.
Yeah, and then we'll have a third story in just a couple of weeks as well, shortly following Ryan's. That's about like the statewide angle here. Some advocates say we really shouldn't be putting DAs in charge of looking at the convictions that their office prosecuted. It's just too personal, and like on its face, it's just not a good model. What people have said is a smart alternative to that is to put a third party in charge, like the Attorney General's office, that can look at these cases from a more objective lens. New York actually has had a program like that has been in operation since 2012. So that's 13 years now, but they have not seemed to manage to get much done. And most people don't seem to know about it, even in this pretty niche world. So we'll dive into that as well. And then a fourth story that is going to be led by two of our colleagues, is based on prison letters. Part of what we thought was important in this series is to hear from the people who have not been exonerated and are still behind bars. Whether or not they're innocent, everyone deserves the right to the same process. And so the fourth story is a story of people who are still on the other side and explaining what that experience has been like for them and still is ongoing. But hopefully, this will all be out in the next month. Please stay tuned. And you can see our first story online now at New York Focus and other outlets across the state. And we'd love to hear from anyone who has any feedback or thoughts. We're all ears.
That's great. Thank you so much. We're talking to Ryan and Willow from New York Focus and the Columbia Investigation Journalism. Thank you so much for letting us know about this issue. And like Willow said, the full investigation, at least the first article, is available on New York Focus now and also will be available on our website. So thank you so much again for both of you.
No, thank you so much for having us on to talk about this.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. We appreciate it.